Good morning, everyone. I'm going to have to give my talk a little bit quicker than I imagined because I actually have to be back at work. So I'm just going to give you an overview of how I got started and tell you a little bit about, even if you don't care about studying diseases, why you should really think about diabetes just a little bit. So I do love my job. I'm probably about 10 or 15 years older than Dr. Monroe. But maybe when I saw his talk, I thought, you know, one thing about science is it probably keeps you pretty young. And so that's one thing that I love about my job. And I get to work with young people. And I get to travel, and I get to be independent. So really with science, it's, you know, Todd has ADD. I don't have that. But, you know, I don't like having a boss. And so that's why I really like this job, is I pretty much get to do what I want. So those are some things about being a scientist that I really like. And before I went to graduate school, I'd never really been out of the country. And I don't have a black dot for everywhere I went, but I've given hundreds of talks across the U.S. on my research. I did grand rounds at Harvard Medical School in March 2013. I've talked in Brazil, Portugal, Spain, France, Turkey, and on someone else's dime. So that's another really exciting thing about research, is if you're good at it, people will pay for you to come talk about your work. So that's because I like to travel, that's another thing I really love about my job. So the way I got started is I liked biology and chemistry equally. I was actually better at chemistry. The intro-level biologies didn't interest me that much until I got to the higher ones, which I liked. So I ended up getting a bachelor's of science degree in both biology and chemistry. And when I went for my PhD, that mix of biology and chemistry really appealed to me a lot, especially as it related to diseases. And that's why I got my PhD in biochemistry. And then I really didn't know what to do. I knew I didn't want to work in industry. And now in biomedical research, if you get a PhD, you pretty much have to do a postdoc. So I went to Boston and I worked in a diabetes research lab for 4 years. And then I started as an assistant professor at LSU in 1996. So probably some of you weren't even born in 1996, but that's how long that I've been working here. And I moved my research lab, even though I still teach over here at LSU, I moved my research lab over to the Pennington Biomedical Research Center, which is just a few miles away. And most of the people over there study disease states, whether it's Alzheimer's disease or cardiovascular disease. But most of us study type 2 diabetes or obesity. And like Dr. Wischusen said, now I'm the director of basic science research over there. So that's a little bit about me. And now I just want to tell you a little bit about diabetes. I'm not going to go into the mechanisms we study in our laboratory, but there are a lot of myths and realities about diabetes. And I just want to share a few of those with you today. So one of the realities about diabetes is there's pretty much documented evidence of this disease for nearly 5,000 years. Like, even the ancient Egyptians knew about this. You know, when people, you know, if you have too much glucose in your blood, that overflows to your urine, and so you have sweet urine, and insects are attracted to that. And there's documented evidence of that. So people have known about diabetes for a long time. And in India, they have a father of medicine who documented this disease very well thousands of years ago. So even though it's been around a long time, that's a fact. That this disease being an epidemic is actually something that is very new. And so here's something I want to show you, and I'm not doing it to scare the crap out of you, but hopefully this scares the crap out of you. So here's this graph, and here's in 1958, and this is the percentage of people that have this disease, which, by the way, why should you care about it? It's the 5th leading cause of death in the United States. That's why you should care about it. In 1958, only 1% of the population, less than 1 million people in this country, had diabetes in 1958. It keeps going up year after year. So here are the millions of people with diabetes on this axis. Here's the percentage of people with diabetes on this axis. Well, when you guys were born, I don't know what you guys did, but you really screwed things up. Because about 1996, we got this epidemic really starts to get hold. And you can see that these numbers are rising. So this is back from 2010. And in the last 5 years, it's got even worse than this. But in 2010, we had 22 million people in this country with type 2 diabetes, and it represented almost 7% of the population. Now, 7% of the people have a disease, which is the 5th leading cause of death. That should scare you. It should scare you a lot. Well, let's think about Louisiana then. Oh, that's the rest of the country, 22 million people, although now it's 28 million people in 2015. Let's look at the percentage of adults in diabetes who are diabetic in Louisiana. And if we look at the overall majority of parishes, over 10% of the people in most parishes have diabetes. And this disease is bad. It's the leading cause of blindness in the world. It's a leading cause of kidney damage in the world. It's a leading cause of limb loss in the world. It's a concern to have this disease. And look how many people in Louisiana. Most parishes, over 10% of the adults have this disease. Well, is that true around the rest of the country? No, it's not. It's much worse here. So it is still bad in other places, but let's take a look at Wisconsin here. There's only, what they call them counties there, of course. There's only one county that has, where over 10% of the adults have diabetes. In California, there's none. In Massachusetts, there's none. So not only do we have an epidemic in this country of this highly debilitating disease, but it's way worse in Louisiana than it is in other places. And these graphs are all from the CDC website, cdc.gov. If you want to look up disease statistics for some project, there's a lot of great information on this website, not just about diabetes, which is a metabolic disease, but a lot of infectious diseases as well. It's a very good resource. This is just to show new cases of diabetes, and the dark red is the worst, and of course Louisiana's in there. So we're saddled with the most new number of cases of diabetes in the country as well. So diabetes affects, over 26 million people in this country now, which is about 8.3% of the population, and I already told you that's worse in Louisiana. We estimate that there are another 7 million people out there that have diabetes, but they don't know that they have it yet. And if these trends continue, 1 in 3 adults will have diabetes by 2050. Now, the cost of this in 2007, which was 8 years ago, is $174 billion, and we know that it's triple that now. So this is a huge healthcare burden. So that's another problem with it. It's just not that this is a disease that people are dying of. It's the care of these people is extremely expensive as well. So it's also a very disabling and deadly disease. I already mentioned to you that it's the leading cause of blindness, kidney failure, and amputations that aren't related to accidents. Now it's up to the 5th leading cause of death in this country, and we know that people that have diabetes have a shorter life expectancy, and they have twice the risk of dying on any given day as a person without diabetes. So those are pretty intimidating numbers to me. So the reality is about diabetes is this disease is an epidemic. Sometimes we just think of infectious diseases and epidemics, but that's not true. Diabetes is an epidemic. Where we live is the epicenter of this epidemic. It's extremely expensive to treat, and it's also very disabling, as I mentioned. Now, if I teach you one thing today, hopefully it's this, that there are 2 different kinds of diabetes, and the 2 types are very, very different diseases. One disease is called insulin-dependent diabetes, or type 1 diabetes, and it used to be called juvenile diabetes, but we don't call it that anymore. And this is an autoimmune disease where you have antibodies that get produced, and we know some of the reasons why, and they attack these kind of cells that are in your pancreas called beta cells. And these are the only kind of cells in your whole entire body, just a few of these cells that make insulin. And if those cells get attacked in this autoimmune disease, you have no insulin and you're dead. So a lot of hormones, thyroid hormone, they're important for development. Steroid hormones, they're important for reproduction. But you're going to be okay. Not insulin. If you don't have it, you're dead. You can't live without it. So before they discovered insulin in 1921, everyone who was type 1 diabetic died within their first few weeks of life. So a lot has changed since 1921 because now we can make insulin in the lab. For a while, we used to get it from slaughterhouses and get the insulin from the blood, and that's how diabetics stayed alive for a long time. But now we can make it in the laboratory, so it's pretty good. But this is an autoimmune disease, and it turns out that of the people that have diabetes, less than 10% of them have this autoimmune disease, type 1 diabetes. And the epidemic that we see in Louisiana and around the country is of type 2 diabetes. And this used to be called non-insulin dependent or adult onset, but we don't call it that anymore. And the reason we don't call type 1 juvenile diabetes is because there are more kids. There are more kids in this country that have type 2 diabetes than type 1 diabetes. And so that's why we tend not to call it juvenile anymore. And type 2 diabetes is a metabolic disease, and there are tons of things that can go wrong with that disease. So it's a really complex disease. When you think about the big killers, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and type 2 diabetes, the reason that they're the big killers is there's hundreds, if not thousands of different things that can cause those diseases. With type 1 diabetes, same thing happens every time. Sickle cell, Huntington, we know exactly what the causes of those diseases are. Every single time the same thing happens. Cancer, cardiovascular disease, and type 2 diabetes, no way, baby. Thousands of different things that can cause that disease. And that's what makes them really challenging, because when you have a cancer patient come in or a diabetes patient come in, you really don't know what's wrong with them. There's 1,000 possibilities. Okay, so even though these diseases of diabetes are really different, one's autoimmune, one's metabolic, they both have the same effects on the body. And the reason for that is what happens when you get diabetic, no matter what the cause, is you have too much glucose in circulation. So you think, glucose, big deal, man, 6-carbon sugar, that should be no problem. That should be innocuous. It's not. Having that in the blood instead of your cells, that's what diabetes is, hyperglycemia. And that's what causes the damage to your kidneys, and that's what causes the blindness, etc. So having that glucose in circulation, too much of it, is absolutely bad. You need to get it into your cells. And so chronic hyperglycemia, that's what diabetes is. So like I already mentioned, most people that have diabetes have the type 2 diabetes, not the type 1 diabetes. And the people that have type 1, they don't have insulin, and so they have to inject it a few times a day for survival. And what insulin does, the primary function of that hormone, it gets the glucose out of the blood and into the cells, and that is required for your daily survival. Like I already told you, type 2 diabetes is much more complex because there are so many different things that can cause the disease, and there are so many different tissues that are involved. Now, if I told you both of these girls had type diabetes, you could guess and you could say, hey, the thin girl is a type 1 diabetic and the fatter girl is a type 2 diabetic. And 85% of the time, you would be right. And so it's true, most type 1 diabetics are lean, and the majority of people who are type 2 diabetic are obese. And so this epidemic of type 2 diabetes that we have in this country, and it's not just our country where there's an epidemic of type 2 diabetes, it's happening in India, in China, in Japan, and other nations that are industrially sophisticated as well. So one thing that we know about diabetes as well is that most people that have type 2 diabetes are obese. So there's something we know about, and this is what we study in my lab, there's something about the obesity that is causing the type 2 diabetes. And we know if people lose weight, they can, type 1 diabetes, you have that the rest of your life. Maybe stem cell transplants will cure it in the future, but our government doesn't give a lot of money for stem cell research in this country because a lot of people don't like that kind of research. Now, I don't agree with that, but that's just a fact. But someday, maybe, they've done it in Canada in clinical trials where they can cure type 1 diabetes with stem cell transplants with cells that make insulin. But in the U.S., we don't have a large emphasis on that, and our primary problem is people with type 2 diabetes. And we know that most people that have type 2 diabetes are obese. But one thing I want you to remember is that most obese people are not diabetic. So don't look at every fat person you say and say, hey, I bet they're diabetic. They're not. So it's true that most type 2 diabetic people are obese, but the reverse is not true. And not most obese people are diabetic, but it puts them at a higher risk, and there's a good chance that they can eventually develop the disease. So remember, I told you there are hundreds, if not 1,000 things that can be wrong to make a person type 2 diabetic. So how do we define them if they all have different things wrong with them? And the way we define them is this. We say they're insulin resistant. So they have this hormone insulin, which we know is absolutely required for survival, but for whatever reason, and there's hundreds of them, they can't respond to insulin. So that's the cause of type 2 diabetes. And things that can improve insulin resistance and make you respond to insulin include weight loss and exercise. Exercise is really good at enhancing insulin action. And they've even done studies on older people where they're starting to get type 2 diabetes, but if they have them walk just 30 minutes a day around their block twice, because, you know, a lot of older people can't, you know, exercise like you and I can, even in the absence of weight loss, even in the absence of weight loss, exercise can still improve diabetes. So exercise is something that is really good for you, even if it's not causing you to lose weight. It makes your glucose metabolism much better, and people who exercise live a lot longer as well. You probably know that already. So with type 2 diabetics, they're insulin resistant, so they can't get their glucose into the cells. And some of the cells that are important in taking up that glucose are fat cells. And the fancy word for fat cell is an adipocyte. And so, you know, when I was in graduate school a long, long time ago, it was thought that fat cells, all they did was store lipid, and really, who gives a whack about that? People didn't really care about it. But now, 30 years later, things have changed pretty significantly, because we know that fat cells, not only do they just store lipid, but they're highly sensitive to this hormone insulin, which you know is critical for survival, but they also have endocrine functions. And what an endocrine function means is a cell makes a hormone, and that hormone acts far away. Like insulin is an endocrine hormone. It's made in the pancreas, and it acts in the liver and in the muscle and in fat tissue. Well, there are hormones that are only made in adipocytes. They're not made in any other cell in your body, and they communicate with your brain to tell you whether you want to have a snack or not, and they communicate with your liver to regulate glucose metabolism, and they communicate with your muscle. And so this is why 99% of the studies that we do in my laboratory are on adipocytes. The reason is if you change or just alter one of those functions, like you make the fat cell so it can't store lipid as well, or you make it so it can't respond to insulin, or you change just one of those half dozen of hormones that are made from fat cells. If you do one of those things, you have type 2 diabetes. You mess with a fat cell, you got type 2 diabetes in a second. And so this tissue is very important in the pathogenesis of type 2 diabetes. And we did we read a study from Harvard Medical School in my lab last week, and what they did it in rats, which, you know, there are some animal models that aren't great to study disease. Cancer, sometimes the way mice get cancer is a lot different than the way humans get cancer, but for diabetes, mice and humans get it the same way. So we do a lot of experiments on mice in my laboratory to study diabetes. But we read this paper. What? We did this, I thought I heard something. They did this study where they took these mice and they only exercised them for 11 days on a treadmill. And they didn't have to do it. They just got in there and did it. It wasn't forced exercise. And then they took those animals that were exercised, and then they took sedentary animals. And they took out the fat. And this is why I want to make a really big point to you, is fat is really good for you as well. It's bad, because if you mess up one of the functions, bam, you got type 2 diabetes. But here's how fat is good for you. They took the fat from the animals that were trained, 11 days, and untrained, sedentary, and they transplanted them into diabetic animals. And in the diabetic animal that got the fat from the trained animal, it cured their diabetes. So when you exercise, even without weight loss, exercise remodels your adipose tissue and changes the hormones it produces to make your overall glucose metabolism in your whole body better. So that's another great thing for exercise. Even in the absence of weight loss, it's remodeling your adipose tissue and affecting your overall body glucose metabolism. So back to realities. There's two kinds of diabetes. Just if you don't remember anything else today, remember that. Type 1, where it's an autoimmune disease and you don't have insulin, and type 2, which is a metabolic disease where you can have defects in lots of different tissues, especially adipose tissue. Now, even though these diseases are very different, they have similar clinical manifestations because what happens in both diseases is you have high blood sugar. Type 2 is the most common, and it's harder to treat because you don't know exactly what's wrong with the patient. And we know that obesity, or excess adipose tissue accumulation, is a key factor in the pathogenesis of type 2 diabetes. Some other realities here is that diabetes greatly increases your risk of cardiovascular disease, and as I've told you a couple times, exercise improves diabetes, even in the absence of weight loss. I'll just end with a few myths about this disease because I hear these things even from my pre-med students all the time. Well, you guys probably know you can't catch diabetes from someone else. But one thing, people with diabetes can't eat sweets or chocolate. That's not true. They just have to be careful and monitor their blood glucose and time it when they have, injected some insulin. So you can still eat things. You just have to be a little bit more careful. And same thing, people with diabetes should have small amounts of pasta or bread or potatoes because, when they break down, they have a lot of sugar in them. They have to be careful, but you can, if you are a well-controlled diabetic, you can eat whatever you want as long as you're paying attention to your blood glucose levels. And there are hundreds of different kinds of insulin on the market, and you can find out whatever one works best for you to get your glucose levels down. People with diabetes should eat special diabetic food. That's a load of crap. People with diabetes are more likely to get colds or other illnesses. Again, that's something not true. The worst myth, and this is the one I hear all the time, is don't eat that candy, you're going to get diabetes. That's not how it works. So eating candy will not give you diabetes. Another myth is fruit is healthy, so you can eat as much as you want. If you're diabetic and you eat 5 pieces of fruit, it's not going to be good because a lot of fruit, even though it's very good for you and it has fiber, you've just got to be careful. So that's the thing about diabetes, is if you have good control, you're going to live just as long as everyone else, but it's kind of a high maintenance disease because you just got to check your glucose levels a lot. Another myth is that insulin causes weight gain, and because obesity is bad, insulin should not be taken. We know that's not true. And remember, most obese people aren't diabetic. So if you're obese but you're exercising, that means your fat tissue is remodeling and it's gonna protect you. So exercise is an important part of this equation. And the worst myth is all diabetics should take insulin. That's not true, especially for people who are type 2 diabetic. Their problem is not that they don't have insulin. Actually, because the insulin's not working, they tend to make more than normal. And that's what we call hyperinsulinemia. And so giving them more insulin doesn't help at all. We just got to treat their insulin resistance, make them so they respond to insulin. And there's hundreds of drugs on the market that do that. And also 2 other options, which are a little hard for people, are weight loss and exercise. So they are both great at improving type 2 diabetes. So here's just some pictures of adipocytes. I already told you why we focus on these cells in my laboratory, because if you alter their function, bam, you've got type 2 diabetes. And I'll skip that and just thank the people in my lab, especially Tanner, who's here today, who is working on a signaling project on adipocytes. Thank you very much.
Jackie, you have time for a question?
I sure do. There's one, and here's another.
Why is there an increase in susceptibility to individuals that are obese with respect to diabetes?
Yep, that's a good question. A lot of times it's because the fat cell has lost its capacity to store that lipid, and so the lipid gets stored somewhere else. And when something's stored in the wrong place, that's called ectopic. And so for a lot of people of type 2 diabetes, their fat is being stored in their liver or in their heart, and that makes them insulin resistant. Another thing that happens is the bigger you get, well, the more fat mass you have, the less your adipocytes respond to insulin. And because a lot of that glucose goes into fat after a meal, that's another reason, because it's in circulation and not in the tissue. And then another thing is we know that obesity greatly affects those hormones that are produced from adipocytes. And because those hormones regulate overall blood glucose metabolism by communicating to the liver and the skeletal muscle, we know all those ways contribute from the fat cells. Good question. Yes?
So you said that type 2 diabetes was defined by insulin resistance.
Yes.
So if a doctor is telling you you are insulin resistant, are they also telling you you have type 2 diabetes, and are they treated differently?
No, I mean, if you are insulin resistant, you could still be pre-diabetic. I mean, to get diagnosed with diabetes, it's the same for type 1 and type 2 diabetes. You do something that's called an oral glucose tolerance test, where you drink a sugar solution, and then they take your blood every 10 minutes. And you know, if you're a non-diabetic person, it goes down after 2 hours. But if you're diabetic, it doesn't go down all the way. And that's bad, because that means that glucose is not clearing, it's staying in your blood. And so that's the definitive diagnosis, the gold standard for an MD to diagnose diabetes is an oral glucose tolerance test. But there are other things that can say that you're insulin resistant, like maybe your insulin levels are high, because that's a sign that insulin's not working, so that your body's making more. So there's a couple different mathematical equations we can do by looking at glucose levels and insulin levels to say you're insulin resistant, and definitely that could mean you're pre-diabetic, or it could mean you are diabetic. So yeah.
Dr. Stephens.
Yes.
First off, looking forward to endocrinology next semester.
Good. What's your name?
Kane McGee.
Okay, got it.
Clinical neurophysiology with Dr. Strain at the
Excellent.
vet school. Are you saying that with exercise, basically it's a conformational contour of fat cells when you exercise, and overall?
We know what
What's taking
happens when you
place?
exercise, and this is a pretty new area of investigation. But we know even the fat tissue, the way it looks under the microscope,
Right.
the morphology looks completely different when people exercise. So even when they're still obese, if they exercise, their fat tissue remodels a lot.
So it's a chain of events.
Yeah, and so with that remodeling, it changes the hormones that are produced. It changes the fat cell's ability to store lipid and go lipolysis and all these other
Right.
metabolic pathways we study. So yeah, we absolutely know that. I mean, people in the past just thought, that exercise was targeting muscle, but we know that that's not true now. That has very profound effects on adipose tissue.
Yeah, I agree. I think I've seen it personally. And a lot of people, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yep.
Other questions?
Remote sites.
There's one back there.
Has the experiment with the mice ever been tested in humans?
Well, it's a lot harder to do experiments in humans. We can't really do very mechanistic studies, and there's no fat transplantation that's been done in humans. That's one thing. There are kinds of fat. If you can make your fat what we call beige, where it expresses these proteins we're studying in the lab, then it's metabolically healthier. But nobody wants increased fat as a solution for type 2 diabetes, right? And this is the problem. Some of the type 2 diabetes drugs actually make you gain weight. And you think, well, that sucks. And it definitely does. But it's much better to be obese and not diabetic than it is to be diabetic and lean, because the diabetes is much, much worse than the obesity.
Thank you.
Yep.
Just real quick, any of the remote sites have a question? Okay, Shreveport, you got your mic on?
Go for it.
I have one question. Does the intensity of the exercise actually affect the benefits that exercise has on diabetes?
That's a really good question, and there are a few papers. I usually don't follow the human literature too much.
Go ahead and mute your mic so we don't get echo.
Oh, yeah, you need to. Okay, done. So what happens is it looks like, and this sucks for me because I hate doing weightlifting. I only like to do cardio. But what they've shown is that it's a balance. So you really need to do, some weight training a couple times a week, and you need to do cardio a couple times a week. So, I mean, the American Diabetes Association, if you look on their website, they do have recommendations for a exercise regimen that will be anti-diabetic. And it's not really my area, but one thing that I remember from reading those studies is that it requires both strength training and cardiovascular fitness, that a combination of both of them is the best anti-diabetic exercise regime.
All righty.
Anything else?
I think we're done.
All right, thanks
Well,
again.
Thank you.